I want to ask you a little bit about the UNC Chapel Hill case and also the affirmative action case with Harvard. The court's hearing these separately, but they touch on, similar issues. So they touch on diversity, proportional representation, discrimination. Can you tell us a little bit about these cases?
Sure. So these are two affirmative action challenges. I mean, there's one out of Harvard, one out of UNC Chapel Hill, as you said, Danielle. First of all, personal aside, I'm a Duke alum and a hardcore Duke fan, so seeing our arch rival UNC kind of be in the Supreme Court's crosshairs is kind of a personally kind of vindicating note for me. But the only reason they granted cert and heard these two cases. So, in theory, you could have a slightly different interpretation of the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause. Applies to state action, and the extent to which affirmative action is a state action issue. You'll have some mixed takes on that. It kind of gets into whether, simply taking federal funding makes the university a state actor. But for all intents and purposes, these two cases are going to come out the same way, because you actually don't necessarily even need to reach the equal protection clause constitutional issue. You could actually just rule on the statutory issue, which is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which directly applies, indisputably to both private and public schools. These two cases out of UNC and Harvard were actually initially consolidated, to use the court terminology, so they were going to hear them at oral argument together. Then after Justice Jackson joined the court, they actually deconsolidated it because she is going to be recused from the Harvard case because she was on their some sort of fancy advisory board or whatnot. So she's recused from the Harvard case, but not the UNC case. But the point here, Danielle, is that the cases are going to come out the same way. And this is actually one issue that even I, who have been kind of a judicial pessimist for as long as I've been thinking and writing about the courts, this is an issue that actually even I am optimistic on. And I'm optimistic on this issue because even just at this point is the sixth vote. There are five kind of more solid votes, that is, for conservative outcomes in most cases, than issue that even he has actually been consistent on going back to his earlier days on the court. So in 2007, there was a case out of Seattle, Washington called Parents Involved, which was a very similar case involving kind of, race-centric, race-specific kind of schooling policies. And he had this famous line, which to this day is probably Chief Justice John Roberts' most famous line he has ever put into an Article III Supreme Court opinion, where he said that, quote, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He has always been kind of an outspoken critic against affirmative action, including kind of the Fisher litigation out of the University of Texas in 2013 and 2016. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this term could see the demise of the Bakke case of 1978 and the Grutter versus Bollinger case of 2003, and therefore end affirmative action in America. The real cherry on top would be if Clarence Thomas, who has been a vociferous critic of affirmative action for decades, if he gets to write the majority opinions. That would just really be delectable.
Absolutely. And we've already had so many great cases come out from the court this last term. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think just how many came out that were so good for us. Even in addition to Roe v. Wade, we had religious freedom cases. We had, the Second Amendment cases. What are your thoughts on why the left constantly wants to only focus on abortion? Why do they always want to make it about the overturning of Roe and bring everything to that, when there are actually a lot of other cases that we've also won on? I mean, school choice, other issues there too, which we also care about. So why do you think the left likes to use abortion as their fear-mongering tool?
It's a great question. I'm not sure that I have kind of a fully thought-out answer to that question. I mean, I guess that I can only speculate, and I guess that speculation has to do with kind of the extent and the pervasiveness and the ubiquity of sexual liberationism and the sexual revolution of the 1960s. I mean, it was in the 1960s that the pill, birth control, started to proliferate, and obviously Roe versus Wade was right there in 1973. And I think for generations of kind of second wave and ultimately third wave feminist leaders who, last time I checked, were still kind of punching above their weight as far as kind of their clout within kind of the political epicenter in this country, they have viewed abortion as being kind of fundamental to women's kind of economic security, to their way of life, and frankly, from kind of like a pagan, secularist, non-religious perspective, to kind of like their basic day-to-day sexual lifestyle. So from their perspective, this is the Dobbs case is 49 years after Roe versus Wade. You're taking away a right, and you're sending women back to kind of I mean, you and I both know these garbage talking points over and over again. It's not going to work. I mean, it's not going to work because if you look at the polling consistently, the American people are far more moderate and reasonable on the issue of the unborn child than the legal, moral, and constitutional rights that the unborn child is entitled to than the Democratic Party and the political left position. I mean, the Democratic Party, earlier this year was voting on Congress statutorily codifying Roe versus Wade, or I think they actually didn't quite get to a Senate vote, but they were talking a lot about it. And what that would have effectively done is it would have legalized via congressional legislation abortion really effectively up until the point of birth, with very, very narrow exceptions throughout the entire country. That is a radical, extreme, and frankly violent, disgusting proposition that would have put the United States on par with such, human rights bastions as like North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and so forth. But the median American rejects that. Most Americans want restrictions on abortion, certainly after the first trimester, and perhaps even reasonable restrictions much earlier than that. So, they were always vulnerable on this issue. I'm not entirely sure why they have put so much capital, but the best I could do is speculate that they have really just kind of intuited the various lies of the sexual revolution and sexual liberationism, and they've kind of just, drank it as mother's milk, so to speak.